Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to try to answer the question, why does it matter how we spell musical notes? Now, the kind of technical name for this is enharmonic or enharmonic equivalence. So let's just get clear what we mean by that. Well, if I play this note on the piano, you could say that note is F sharp. Why? Well, if this note's F, this is a semitone or a half step above it, so it's F sharp. But of course, it's also G flat because there's G. And so if I come down to that very same note, it's G flat. I could also give it a third name. I could call it E double sharp because this is E. Single sharp takes it to there. That would be E sharp. And this would be E double sharp. So there are three possibilities. So maybe it doesn't really matter if I call that note F sharp or G flat or E double sharp. Well, everybody knows that's the name of the note, so we don't need to worry. Or maybe we do need to be concerned a little bit about it. Sometimes, I have to say, you can be writing a note and you think, well, it doesn't really matter too much whether I call this note F sharp or G flat, but sometimes there's a context. So, for example, if I were using this note and I was in the key of G major, well, the scale of G major goes G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. So it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that I call it F sharp and I don't call it G flat. When you have a scale, well, you have one of each letter name, don't you? G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. In this case, the F is F sharp. So it doesn't really make sense to have no F at all and then to have two kinds of G. G, A, B, C, D, E, G flat, G natural. And then you're going to spend the whole piece thinking, I wonder if this note is a G or a G flat. And we don't seem to have seen any Fs for a long time. So it's much more logical in G major to call this note F sharp. However, if I was in the scale or the key of D flat major, well, D flat major goes like this. D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C, D flat. So to get one of each letter name, that's how that works out. So if I'm in D flat major, it doesn't make any sense to call that F sharp, but it makes total sense to call it G flat. So sometimes the enharmonic choice that you make will be kind of determined by the key. Where it gets a bit more awkward is when you're in a key, but then maybe you're using a note that doesn't quite belong to the key just to kind of make it a bit more colourful for a moment. And have a look at the first example that I've just compiled to illustrate this point. You can see that this key signature is two sharps. We're in the key of D major. And, we can be pretty sure we're in D major. It starts on D, it finishes on D. This is how this melody goes. Okay, so that's in D major, and the key signature says if you come across an F, play F sharp, so that's what I did there. If you come across a C, play C sharp, so that's what I did there. So this enharmonic thing, or spelling of notes, is not really affecting F sharp there or C sharp there because the key signature is covering that. But then what about this note here? Well, it's a kind of little note in the melody that adds a bit of colour. It's using a note that's not quite in the key, but it's just making it a bit more colourful. I mean, if I didn't use that note, I just played another A, you might tell me, well, it makes it a bit boring. You're just repeating those A's, but by going A flat, back to A, you sort of think, oh, that's a nice little twist, isn't it? That just makes that slightly more interesting, slightly less predictable. But the question is, should that note really be A flat or should it be G sharp? Now, this is an example of one that's not entirely crystal clear. Is there anything wrong with calling it A flat? Well, at one level, not particularly. However, we are dealing with a key that's using sharps, And if this note were a G sharp instead of an A flat, it kind of might be slightly more logical, because G sharp would be the next sharp in the key signature. So 2 sharps is D major, the 3rd sharp is G sharp, which would take us to A major. And you might think actually G sharp followed by A is kind of hinting at the key of A major. So if I was going to put chords in here, I might start with a chord of D major, and then I might say, oh, I'll use a chord in A major with a G sharp in it, and then go to a chord of A major before I come back to D major. So sometimes it's kind of like, actually it's more sensible in the melody to have a sharp instead of a flat, or a flat instead of a sharp. Sometimes it's when you're looking at the chords as well, you think, oh, actually, yeah, if I was going to use a chord 5 in A major, followed by a chord 1 in A major, and then carry on in D major, well, it kind of makes sense if I'm thinking in A major for this to be a G sharp, not an A flat. So you see the sorts of things that we have to think about. Then, you might look at this note and think, well, this is another colouring note, isn't it? If I play the last 2 bars, the last 2 measures, but I play E natural instead of E sharp, it sounds like this. That's kind of more what you're expecting, because that's all in D major. But when I play the E sharp, you're a bit surprised. But you see and hear, it just adds a little bit of colour to it. So why on earth would I call that note E sharp when probably most people would recognise it as F? If you play the piano, you think, oh yeah, that note's F. You wouldn't immediately think to call it E sharp, would you? But of course, E sharp is an enharmonic equivalent of F. In other words, it sounds exactly the same as F, but it looks different. So why have I bothered to use E sharp? Well, we've already said that in the key of D, well, F is sharp, so we've got an F sharp before it, we've got an F sharp after it. So does it kind of make sense to mess with that F sharp and then call this F natural, then go back to F sharp again? Or does it actually make more sense to say, well, the note I was expecting was E, and actually all I've done is I've altered that E. I've done a chromatic alteration to the E by making it E sharp. So it's not that I've taken the note F sharp and chromatically altered the F sharp to F natural. It's that I've taken the expected note of E and I said, but instead of E, let's change that E to E sharp. So this is another consideration. What do we expect the note to be? And is this note some chromatic alteration of what we're expecting it to be? And does it make more sense to think of it like that than to say, in this case, let's call it F natural? So I'm purposely looking at some of the grey areas here, because sometimes it's really obvious what it should be. Sometimes it's not quite so clear. So, in this case, I think it's right to call that E sharp rather than F natural. And I think it's wrong to call that A flat because of the reasons we talked about. I would call that G sharp. So, that's a couple of accidentals that raise questions of spelling or enharmonics in a melody. Well, what I've done next is to produce something in kind of 4-part harmony. So we can kind of think, well, how does this play out with chords then? So let me play you this little thing that I've just written for the purpose. Okay, now you can hear there's a few colourful things going on in there. So, how do we decide the enharmonics with this? Well, the first one we've got to look at is this, and we're going to relate it to our key signature. We've got B flat in the key signature, which means we're either in F major or in D minor. Well, we've got a chord of F major to start. We've got a chord of F major to finish. There's another chord of F major at the end of the first phrase. There's a perfect cadence in F major there. There's a perfect cadence in F major there. It's all saying this piece of music is in the key of F major. But it has some of these colouring notes, doesn't it, to make it sound a bit more interesting. So let's have a look at this. D sharp. Now, when I played that D sharp, I mean, it probably sounded all right, I hope. Anyway, the first three chords is the D sharp. Going on to a D. So is there any reason why we shouldn't really call that D sharp? Because in this case, it would be completely wrong to call it a D sharp, even though it's the right sound. Let's think why. We're starting in F major, as we said. That's a chord 1 in F major, F, A, C. Those are the notes of the chord. And what I'm doing here is a little device called a secondary dominant. So this is where chords help us to sort out the spelling. So a secondary dominant, briefly, is when you're in one key, but you go 5 to 1 or 5/7, dominant seventh to 1, the tonic chord, in a different key. But the 1, even though it's 1 in a different key, is also a chord in your prevailing key. So we're in F major. This is a chord of 1 in B flat major, but it's also chord 4 in F major. It happens to be in first inversion. That's fine. So in other words, what's going on here is this is a secondary dominant in the key of B flat major. So I'm going dominant seventh in B flat major to the tonic chord of B flat major. This is a 5/7, a dominant seventh in its last inversion, going to the tonic chord of B flat major in its first inversion. So if I'm in the key of B flat major, this is my scale: B flat, C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B flat. Well, is this note E flat? Or is it D sharp? It's E flat, isn't it? So it would be wrong to call that D sharp. That's a much clearer example because this chord is functioning in B flat major and E flat is the note that belongs to B flat major, not D sharp. So in that case, we can categorically say it would be wrong to call that a D sharp, even though it sounds good. So sometimes spelling is crystal clear, sometimes not quite so clear. Now, what on earth is going on when we get to this point? We're supposed to be in F major, and we've got a B natural and an A flat and a D flat. Oh my goodness. Has this guy completely lost the plot, you're asking? Well, that's a question my wife asks frequently. Anyway, in this case, this chord here is something we call a German 6. Now, if you're thinking German 6, hello, don't worry too much about that. And, you can find some stuff from us elsewhere that will tell you about what German 6 is all about. But take it from me, it's something we call a chromatic chord. So it's when we're in a key, but we kind of do something that kind of colours the chord a little bit. And very briefly, how you form a German 6 is you say, what's the sixth note of the scale? We're in F major, so the sixth note of the scale is D. We take the sixth note and we lower it. So D becomes D flat. So we're not saying C sharp because C sharp would be taking the fifth note of the scale and raising it. But what I'm saying is we take the sixth note of the scale and we lower it. So the sixth note's D, lower it, it becomes D flat. So that's why it's correct for that to be a D flat. What we do next, above the D flat, we have to find an augmented 6. And that is B natural. Now, if it was C flat, that would be a minor 7, so it wouldn't be an augmented 6. So that's why it's right that we call that B natural. We put the tonic in the middle, so that's F because we're in F major, that's what that's doing there. And then we put a perfect fifth above the bottom note. So the bottom note's D flat, a perfect fifth above that is A flat. So this A flat is right. So because this is a special chord, what we call a chromatic chord, a German 6, the spelling of that chord matters. You could say, well, I think I'd like to call that C flat. It sounds just the same, D flat, A flat, F, C flat, absolutely right. But that would be a different chord actually. May sound the same, but that would be a chord 5/7, a dominant seventh, in the key of G flat major, for example. So it would go on from there to a chord in G flat major, whereas this one is going on to a chord in F major. Very different sound, isn't it? So the enharmonics matter. If I spell this chord with a C flat at the top, I'm saying, aha, this is a dominant seventh in G flat major. I'm going on to a tonic chord of G flat major. But if I call it B natural at the top, I'm saying, actually, this is a German 6 in F major, and it's going on to a chord in F major. So it kind of really matters. So even though you're looking at this chord thinking, well, 3 of those 4 notes have got nothing to do with F major, actually the chord is a chromatic chord in F major, and it functions in a particular way that makes it matter that that is B natural, not C flat. That's A flat, not G sharp. That's D flat, not C sharp. So if you know about German 6, hopefully you followed that argument. If you're thinking, I'm completely lost now, don't worry too much, but take away the general idea that sometimes the way a chord works in a key will dictate the spelling of the note. So that's what's going on there. Okay, let's look at the next one. Can you see down here, I've put a G flat in there in the alto part. Now, you might say, well, that kind of makes sense. So we're in F major, we've got B flat in the key signatures, so using another flat kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But actually, what's going on here? Well, this is another of these secondary dominants, because this chord is chord 2 in F major, but it's also chord 1 in G minor. And this chord is a chord 5 going to a sort of 5/7 in G minor. So this is just another one of those secondary dominants that we met at the beginning. So we're going 5 or 5/7 to 1 in another key, but the chord 1 in this other key is a chord in our prevailing key. So we've then got to key reference this properly, because if we're in G minor, the 7th note of the scale is F sharp. So it wouldn't be right to call this G flat, because it's the 7th degree of the scale of G minor, and we are functioning in G minor here. So this should be an F sharp. So it's another definitive place where you've got to say, yeah, actually, there's good reason why that should be F sharp, not G flat. Okay, oh, here's another one. What's going on here? D flat. Well, really this chord, if it had a D natural, would be this. So 2 B flat, so D natural and a G. And in the key of F major, that will be chord 2, a G minor chord in its first inversion. And all we're doing is just making it a bit more colourful by taking this note that belongs to chord 2 and lowering it. So the chord 2 is G, B flat, D, and I'm now calling it G, B flat, D flat, what we call a chromatically altered chord. I'm making that little chromatic alteration to the chord. The decider here is, in this chord, that note should be D natural, G, B flat, D. So by lowering it, I've altered the D. I'm not going to call it C sharp because I didn't start with C and then raised it to C sharp. I started with D and lowered it to D flat. So that would be correct to have D flat there and not C sharp. So I hope this is all kind of making sense. Then we've got another little pile up here, haven't we? Well, if we just look at this for a moment, I'm starting on this F major chord in second inversion, so chord 1 in second inversion. Then I've got these chromatic notes, this C flat and G sharp, going on to a B flat and a G natural in the middle parts. And really, it's just a little bit of colour. These are what we call chromatic passing notes. Now, this is a bit more of a moot point because, you know, what have I done with this C flat? I'm going on to B flat. So should that C flat be called B natural? Should it be C, B natural, B flat? Or actually, is this what I've done? I've started with C and I've chromatically altered C. So it becomes C flat and then B flat. That's the logic of this. I started with C. I modified the C to make it a C flat, to make it more colourful, then I went on. So you could kind of say, well, I'm going to call it B natural because, you know, I'm anticipating that B flat, but I'm going to call it B flat, B natural on the way. I mean, it's possible you could do that. Wouldn't be wrong necessarily. You see what I mean? Some of these enharmonic spellings really matter. Some of them you think, well, I don't know, could be either way. And what about this tenor note? You know, you could say, well, I've called it G sharp because I'm sort of anticipating this G natural, but should I have called it A flat? Because isn't it an alteration of this A? So we'll go A flat, G. One thing I think about a situation like this is that it's good to be consistent, because what we've done here is we've said, well, that C flat is an alteration of the previous C. But in the tenor part, we said, well, this G sharp is in anticipation of the following G. Well, surely those two parts are doing the same thing. So either we go C, C flat with A flat, or we say, I'm going to go C, B natural with a G sharp. So at least the two parts are being treated consistently. So there is a case to be said for using the first chord, then going B natural in the alto with G sharp in the tenor. But there's also a case to be said for, here's your first chord, going for the C flat in the alto and the A flat in the tenor. So it's kind of, it depends how you see it there. So sometimes there's a bit of flex with how we spell notes. Sometimes there's a definitive answer. So I hope that's kind of got us into thinking, oh yeah, enharmonics, how we spell notes actually matters. What are the things that we have to think about in order to focus on that? So I hope you've found that a helpful exploration of the topic. Now, you may want to go and see other things that Music Matters is able to offer you. So let me invite you to click on www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of courses there, merch, all sorts of things. One of the things you might be interested in is joining Maestros, Music Matters Maestros. It kind of gives you extra bonuses beyond everybody else. So that's exciting. So you can join at level 1. It's nothing to do with ability, but level 1 gives you all sorts of perks and emojis and things. And then as you go up the levels, there are more and more things that come your way, including monthly live streams, early access to videos, become much more closely involved in the Music Matters community. And people who do that have just written to us over and over again to tell us how much they've got from all of that just by stepping into the Music Matters Maestros, as we call it. So if you go onto that website, you'll see a link to Maestros on the homepage. Have a click, see what's there, and see if level 1 or level 2 or level 3 is something you would like to join, because we would love to have you as part of our Maestros group.